Welcome to Let's Create a Registration Form with ngformrules. Let's dive right in. Currently, I have a very simple Angular application running on my machine. And the first thing we'll need to do is install ngformrules from npm. Now that this is installed, we're going to import a few things into our main app module. We've added the reactive forms module from Angular itself, as well as the forms rules module from ngformrules. Let's go ahead and add a new file now that will hold the models that will represent the data that will be in our form. So we have three interfaces, the main one being registration. So we're going to have a username, a password. We're going to ask the user to confirm their password. Then we have a details object, which has the person's name, as well as an array of tags, and a tag has a title. So these tags will be perhaps, things that they're interested in, and they'll each have a title. And then lastly, just a Boolean of whether or not they accept the terms for registration. Now that we have those in place, let's update our component to have a form group that we can use in our template and set up some basic things with ngformrules. We've added a form variable, which will be the main form group used in our template. We have a model settings variable, which we'll use in just a minute to create this form group. We have just a simple onSubmit function that will be called when the form gets submitted, just so we can see the value of the form. In our constructor, we're receiving via Angular dependency injection an instance of reactive forms rule service, which comes from ngformrules. And so now in our ng on init, we're going to create some very simple model settings that just has two properties, not even having any validation logic yet, and then creating our form group based off of that, just so that we can get something onto the screen. So we've created some simple model settings that are strongly typed to our registration model. And this create function takes a delegate that receives an instance of model settings builder from ngformrules, and it simply returns an array of properties that we create using the builder that was provided. So we're creating a username property and an accept terms property. And then right here we are creating a form group using our reactive forms rule service based upon those model settings. So we have our form group set up, so let's update our template to use that form group. So there's nothing special going on in this template. There's nothing specific to ngformrules. We just have a regular form where we're assigning the form group to the one we've made in our component, as well as when the form gets submitted, we want it to call our onSubmit function. And then essentially for every property that we'll add, we're just going to have a label, the input, and then if there are any errors for this given control, we're going to show those. So we're doing that for username as well as accept terms. And then we're just going to have a button that will be disabled if the form is invalid. So let's save all these changes that we made, and let's look at the results in our browser. We see that we have our form and we have our username and accept terms. So if I enter in some values and accept the terms, click register, We see that our form value looks as we would expect it to. Now there's no validation going on right now, so let's add some simple validation logic for both of these two properties. We've created a total of 3 validation tests. The property function from Builder takes as an optional second parameter a delegate that takes the property that it creates and allows you to set it up however you want. So we can see that we are adding a validation test to the array of tests for validation for this property, and we're giving it a name of required. This is the validation message if the test fails. And then this is the rule for the test. So it's taking in an instance of registration since username is a property of registration. And we're just making sure that there's a value for it. We're doing the same exact thing here for accept terms. We just change the message and the rule is the same. It's a Boolean, but it's still just making sure that it's truthy. And for username, we added a second validation test. We named it length, gave it the message, just making sure that the length of the username is between 5 and 15 characters. And this fourth parameter, optional to valid name test, this is a condition rule. So we're saying we only want to run this rule. It's called a check rule. We only want to run this if the condition rule passes. So we don't want to check the length if there is no username value. So with these tests in place, let's grab a look at our updated form on our browser. So immediately in our browser, we see the effects of adding these tests. For username, we see our required test has failed, and we see the message, as well as for accept terms. As far as the structure of the error object on the Angular control for ngFormRules, we're always going to have an ngFormRules object, and then we're going to have a message string, and this is just a shortcut to the message of the first test that failed. So any property could have any number of tests, but this is just a nice shortcut to access that first message. Then we'll have a failed object, and this will have every test that failed. So it will list it by name and have its corresponding message. So for username and accept terms, they're both required and there's no value for them. So we see those messages. We also see that the register button is disabled because this will only be enabled if the entire form is valid. So if we click accept terms, we see that that error object goes away. If I type into username a character, our required test has passed, but now our length test has failed because it is not between 5 and 15 characters. So if I continue to type within a valid length, the message goes away, register becomes enabled. If I continue to type beyond 15 characters, message comes back. If I clear it out, we see the required message one more time, and entering in a valid value and clicking register, we see the value of the form just as we would expect. So let's add our password and confirm password properties now and add some validation tests as well as an editability test. We added a password property, and just like username, we have a validation test that makes sure that it has a value. We have a confirm password property. We added a validation test to make sure that confirm password equals password. And then we added a dependency property. And so since we're making sure that confirm password and password equal each other, we want to be able to listen for changes to confirm password, and that happens implicitly. But we also want to be able to react to value changes to password. And so that is what this dependency properties array is doing. We can list out the properties we want to listen for value changes for. And then underneath this, we added an edit test. And so an edit test determines whether or not a property is editable, whether or not the control is disabled. And we are basing this on whether or not there's a value for password. So if there isn't a password entered, they're not allowed to enter in a confirm password. And once again, since we care about the value of password, we added it as a dependency property. So let's quickly update our template with these two controls with their given labels and error messages if they are invalid. And let's check this out in the browser. We see our password and confirm password controls. Passwords required test is failing and confirm password is disabled. As soon as we enter in a value for password, confirm password becomes enabled and its match password test fails. If we update it to equal password, its validation test passes. And we can also see that the confirm password must match test listens to both changes in confirm password as well as in password. So that's all working together nicely. With this in place, let's work to add a nested form control property to our form. We added a details property, and if we look back at our model, we see that registration has a details object, and details has a name and a tags array. We'll deal with tags later, but for now, we're concerned with name. So for the details property, we're saying that that property, it itself has properties, and this is just an array of properties. And we're creating one called a name. And this is just like when we were creating password or username before. This property just happens to belong to the details property. So we're creating a validation test with a name and a validation message. And for the rule function, the first parameter to rule is always the value of the property's parent. So in this case, it's details. And the second optional parameter is always the value of the form at the root level, so registration. So our rule is checking that the details name does not equal the registration's username. And for our dependency properties, we are going up a level from the name under details. So we're going up a level to registration and looking at the username property. So we want to listen to value changes to username. And lastly, we only want to run this rule if the name property in details has a value. So we're going to update our template to make use of this new property. Save that and open it up in our browser. So down here we have our details section in our name property. If we enter in a username and update the name to be the same value, we get our different than username test to fail. If we update the username, we see that the test now passes. So we have a nested form group property listening to value changes of itself as well as one of its parent's properties, and it is running validation based upon those two values. So that is pretty cool. Now let's work to get the tags array working under details as well. We added our tags property, and we remember that tags is an array of type tag, which has a title. So we add tags and we set its array item property using the array item property function on the builder. And here we say what properties each array item has. So since we're working with a tag has a title, and we're building this title property. We're adding a validation test with a name and message. And here, instead of just a simple rule, we're using a rule group. A rule group is a collection of rule sets. A rule set can be a rule or rule group, so they can be nested infinitely and we can have whatever kind of logic we want. So if we work inside out, we have a rule group here, and we have a rule that says the title can't have the word tag in it, and we say that it has to have a number. So we don't need all of these rules to pass. We need any one of them to pass. So if it has the word tag, but it has a number in it, it will pass. If it doesn't have tag in it and it doesn't have a number, then it will pass, etc. So that's this rule group. And then it belongs to a parent rule group, which has a rule that says we just need a title, and then the rule group we just looked at. And this parent rule group needs all of its rule groups to pass. So it needs this rule to pass, and then it needs this rule group to pass. And that's the logic there. If we scroll down, we also added this add tag function. So in our template, we're going to allow users to type in an input box, click a button to add a tag. And so in order for the new array items to more or less inherit these validation tests that are part of our model, we're going to make use of this add array item property control off of our reactive forms rule service. So what we're doing is just making sure that we're getting a value for the new tag to add. And we're grabbing access to the array item property that we created here. So there's a number of ways you can do this, but we're just traversing through our model settings, getting the details property, and then getting its tags property and getting its array item property. Then from the form itself, we're getting the form array that we're wanting to add the form item to. And we're passing those to add array item property control and then an optional default value. So we're setting the title of the new tag that we want to add. So let's update our template to make use of this array. And as I mentioned, we're going to have an input where they can enter in a new tag, a button that we'll call the add tag function we just looked at, and then we're going to see each tag that they've added, any validation messages, and they can also edit the tag that they added. So let's check it out in the browser. Down here we have our input and our button to add a tag. I'll add one called Angular, and this tag is fine. If I add one called my dash tag, It fails the validation test because it has the word tag in it. If I get rid of the word tag, it passes. Or if I put tag back in and add a number, it passes because our internal rule group said that it can either not have tag in it or it has to have a number in it. So we see those rules both working. And then lastly, if we clear it out, it fails because it's required. So there's an example of working with some form arrays as well as using a more complex rule group. We're going to add one last validation test for our username that uses an async rule. So we added this one last validation test to make sure that the username isn't already taken. And we're using the rule async function from the builder. This is just like rule, except that instead of returning a Boolean, it returns an observable of a Boolean. So our function is just logging to the console that we're looking up the username so we can see when it's happening. And then we're using the of function from RxJS, which returns an observable. We can pretend that we're calling an API or some service that asynchronously returns the result. And we're just making sure that the username isn't user123 or user321. Additionally, for our property, we're setting some value change options. Now you can set this at a couple different levels, but for now, we're just seeing that when this property itself changes and we're performing async validation, we want to wait 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds in between changes before firing the validation test. If this was calling some API over the network, we wouldn't want to necessarily perform validation on every keystroke. That would be a lot of API calls potentially, but rather we want to wait until the user has stopped making changes for 2 seconds before firing our request. And then additionally, we want to only fire it if the value has in fact changed. So if they typed in something and just backed it out, no need to fire a request because the value didn't change. So with this in place, we're just going to add one thing to our form, and we're just going to show the username status that will show us in better detail when some validations are firing in an asynchronous fashion. So let's grab a look in the browser. So if we enter in a username, we see that the synchronous tests still run, but the asynchronous test didn't run. We would have seen it logged to the console. And the reason for that is that asynchronous tests will only be run if all of the synchronous tests pass. So if I enter in one more character, the synchronous tests all pass. The status went from pending to valid, and our asynchronous test was executed, and it passed. I'm going to enter in 2 characters here, and we'll see what happens after clearing the console. So 2 characters, pending, invalid, and it only ran our test once, and that's because we have that debounce milliseconds to wait 2 seconds after value changes before executing. So it's invalid. I'll enter in it one more time, pending, and now we're valid. It ran it once. Now let's type in a few characters and back them out. Pending, valid, and it didn't execute, and that's because our value didn't change. Well, I hope walking through creating that registration form helped showcase some of the power of ngformrules. I'd invite you to visit our GitHub page that has more information on how to get started, as well as looking through our documentation and our full set of examples. Thank you so much.